Welcome everybody to the Webfest, which is becoming a regular feature of the work of the UNESCO Chair in Global Adult Education, housed within the Faculty of Education through the Department of Arts, Open Communities and Adult Education at the University of Malta. We had the first two in 2021, always anchored by Joe Van Zel. He is the person you're seeing there, the person we refer to whenever we have issues. He is an academic with an expertise in distance learning, amongst other things, of course. And of course, the first one was in 2021. It was the Paulo Freire. And then that took us 3 days. It was the birth centenary of Paulo Freire. Then we had an extra day and we dedicated that to Raymond Williams, the Welsh adult educator and literary and cultural writer, theorist, whatever, even empiricist in terms of his work on communications. The following year, last year, right about this time, we moved towards Africa from Europe and, Paulo Freire from Brazil, actually. And we focused on Julius Nyerere, who made a great contribution to education and to adult education in particular. And this year, it's the turn of Don Lorenzo Milani. I would like to make this very clear. I'm not very happy that all of them are men, because so what we're going to do next year is change the criteria. It won't just be birth centenaries until we have to wait for a birth centenary to have to mark difference, as we already done in terms of ethnicity. Next year will also be the birth centenary of another great Italian educator, Alberto Manzi, which should not be ignored. But I plan to do something 3 years after the passing of Bell Hooks, Gloria Watkins, better known as Bell Hooks. Now, it is this year it's going to be Don Lorenzo Milani on the 100th anniversary of the birth centenary year of Don Lorenzo Milani. And we'll be holding this in English and Italian to facilitate the participation of the majority who are Italian. We would have loved to have had Luis Corso Toral, one of the leading scholars on Don Milani, certainly the leading probably scholar on Don Milani in Spain, but because of his health situation, where he had to go to hospital, tests, etc., he reluctantly could not participate, but he would have loved to. So that's one regret I have. I had discussed this with him in Bergamo a month or so ago. Without further ado, because I have to be very conscious of time in this situation, I'm going to invite our dean, the dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Malta, Professor Colin Kalea, to open the seminar. Colin, this web space is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to welcome everyone for this Don Lorenzo Milani Century Webfest during this year. And I think it's an interesting person that a number of our academics have actually contributed to the work on Don Milani. Over here, we're seeing Peter, we're seeing Michael, who worked on publications. There is our colleague, Carmel Borch, who couldn't be with us.
He's in Glasgow.
Because he's in Glasgow. And others who saw on this Don Milani a person that one can learn a lot when it comes to critical education, when it comes to transformative education. So I am pleased that we are hosting this Webfest, where we come together and learn from each other about this person, about this person. I would like also to say that as a faculty of education, we always look at not just looking at the academic contribution, but we look also at the way this person puts the theory into practice through the Barbiana School. And I must say that at the moment, as a faculty, we are pushing forward and discussing two particular projects. I say something about them, but these are in the process. One is where we're working towards having an outlet which is an inclusive outlet at the campus, where we provide the possibility for persons with disability a place to work together with others, in particular students who will support this project, and it will be a bookshop, with the theme of tea. So you can go to this place where you can take tea from different countries, from different places, while discussing a book and fair trade, the idea of promoting fair trade. So this is one aspect that the faculty in practice tries to bring the teaching and the example of persons like Don Milani, where you put in practice this. Something else that just before this, where I was discussing with someone, we are looking at the idea of a school which addresses the population of students which are not being reached enough by the education availability that we have in our country. We believe that if there is the willingness and a lot of people who are not succeeding can succeed. And as a faculty, we are looking at putting this. The faculty will be, what backs such initiatives, but others from different sectors will be part of this venture. So in this venture, for example, we're going to have the outlet, which is soon opening. The venture between a cooperative which emerged from a school, the organization of cooperatives, a group of book lovers who will be working on the issue of the bookshop, and the faculty and what we call CEAR, the Center for Sustainable Development. So this venture, which I'm sharing here for the first time, is I think was appropriate to share it here because we're going to be discussing this great person, a person that was not appreciated by many, but I'm sure that he was appreciated by those who benefited from his contribution to society. so I welcome you for this. Hopefully, this will be an interesting academic discussion, but academic in the spirit of social justice that doesn't stop with talk, but acts. So welcome to this webfest, and hopefully we'll learn a lot from each other. Thank you.
Okay, I've unmuted now. Thank you very much. I would now, thanks, Colin. I know you're very busy to find time from your busy schedule to attend and to open and to support us on this project. I can assure you this project is not only an academic project. Some of the people involved, some are academics, but some are involved at a grassroots level and not in academia. We always try to look for this mix, and we try to involve people who are directly involved with the figure concerned. Like if you look at our Freire Fest, we had even Nita Freire, but she got mixed up with the time, the time barrier between Brazil and Malta. We've had people who worked closely with Paulo Freire. We look at the Raymond Williams one. We had the president, the chairperson of the Raymond Williams Society of Wales. Look at the Nyerere one. We had people who collaborated with Nyerere in Tanzania. This time we have Eduardo Martinelli, who is one of the 8 students at Barbiana, who probably will explode a few myths that we have about Don Milani. But that I'm not going to venture into that because I would have to tread very, very carefully. But I'm sure, I hope Eduardo will open up as he opened up with me personally on this. Now I think it's a solemn moment because we want to remember a colleague of ours who was cut off in his prime, 65 years of age. And can we have the photograph of Ronald Sultana? He's our academic mainstay in our faculty and also in the international sociology of education, comparative education, and guidance and counseling scenes, amongst other things. And it was a week ago. I got a terrible phone call from our mutual friend Godfrey Baldacchino, telling me suddenly that Ronald is no more. He died probably in his sleep, and which is the best way to go, but not for your relatives and your wife. And it shocked us, and I don't think we have recovered. We are still reeling from this sudden jolt to our self-confidence, also because it underlines the fact that we can go at any, could be in the you never know what's going to happen to you. And for Ronald is going to be, for me, it's going to be a watershed. There's going to be in my relationship to sociology or social research when there was Ronald and afterwards, after he left. If I'm going to live long, if my hourglass is going to keep will not be emptied in a very short while. We never know. Ronald Sultana was engaged in adult education. It was not his main area, but he had a great admiration for that person, the person who was in many respects an adult educator and has influenced a lot of people in Malta and possibly even in Australia and Canada, because the organization branched out of Malta. I mean, Colin himself spent 5 years in Sudan, I believe. So he can vouch for that, which had a great influence on the formation of educators here. Apart from our teacher training institution, we cannot minimize a great institution in Malta, whether you believe in it or not, but it's there. It's one of the most hegemonic institutions, hegemony in a positive sense, not necessarily in a negative sense, which is the Roman Catholic Church. And we're celebrating Don Milani. who obviously had issues with the Catholic Church, but he always defended that. And Ronald, despite his secular approach later on in life, but Ronald was started off as a member of the Society of Christian Doctrine, and he claims, now he said this to me countless times ad nauseam, that he got his early pedagogical formation from that organization. And he wrote he had a great admiration for the founder of the Society of Christian Doctrine, Dun George Preka. Presented him always with warts and all, not a hagiography. And that was his major contribution to adult education. And he's also written, because of his involvement and his specialization on vocational education, he also wrote about workers' education within the dockyard in Malta, which is the heartland of the traditional heart of the closest thing we had to an industrial working class. I remember when there was a huge tragedy and 8 or 9 people lost their lives. There was a book, a memento, and he wrote a book about adult education and the dockyard. So, in many respects, Ronald too made a contribution to adult education. So, I would like us to observe a 1 minute silence in honor of this great academic, a mainstay in the international adult education field. And I'm not saying that because I'm Maltese like him. A person who's been just only less than a couple of years ago was conferred an honoris causa, a doctorate honoris causa from Laval University in Quebec, and was recently even awarded a highly prestigious thing concerning counseling, guidance and counseling. He has influenced many people, has touched their lives. He has drawn lots and lots of people, some of them educators today, towards what we call critical pedagogy, the kind of pedagogy to which Don Milani made a tremendous contribution. So I think we start observing a 1 minute. I would suggest that we start observing impeccably a 1 minute silence. And Joe, can you keep the time for us? You're much better than I am. After 1 minute, life has to go on. We resume our work. That's the way probably Ronald himself would have wanted it.
Okay, Peter.
Okay. I was looking at the time, in fact. Well, thank you for observing this. I'm sure Ronald himself would have appreciated it. It is a mark of respect to a person who has made a great contribution. And I personally know him as a friend. I first got to know him professionally and working with in 1988. Joe Van Zel was probably one of his first students. And yeah, I first got to know him in 1983. We took a course with Edward de Bono. Well, that's Ronald Sultana for you. He was born in 1958, passed away 2023. Now, without further ado, we move on to a part of the world where Ronald had studied. That was New Zealand. Well, next to New Zealand, you've got Australia. I would not want to keep Helen awake too much because it's 2 o'clock or half 2 in the morning there. so we will be in bed at the time. Helen, it's over to you to talk about literacy in Australia and the
Thank you.
influence of Don Milani.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, it's 3:21 a.m. here in Australia, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joining with you today. So good morning from my part, good evening to you. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I especially would like to thank Professor Peter Mayo for the invitation. And although we've never personally met, I can really say that he has been exceptionally influential in my understandings of Don Lorenzo Milani, as has other scholars from the University of Melbourne. And that's opened up a completely new way for me to see education. So I thank Professor Peter Mayo, but also the other scholars as well. So in the next half an hour or so that I'm going to speak with you today, I'd like to share with you some reflections about literacy education in Australia. And the way that I'd like to frame this is to use the scholarship of Don Lorenzo Milani as a lens to examine contemporary literacy, the way that contemporary literacy is conceptualised, or really should be conceptualised in the Australian context. So I'm going to use some quotes directly from Lettera a una professoressa to frame my discussion. Now, I must preface anything that I say by saying that Lorenzo Milani is not at all well known in the Australian circle, in the scholarship of critical pedagogy. Unlike Freire, whose work is lauded by critical scholars in particular, and by those who believe that education is social justice, Milani remains relatively obscure. Now, in fact, when I began my PhD studies in 2016, the University of Melbourne, which is Australia's top university, the libraries did not house any of Milani's texts. And so I think that this is really quite telling with regards to, if we're determining how well known he is. So I was fortunate to serendipitously come across visiting scholar Professor Peter Mayo's talk on Milani, which then set me, as I said earlier, on a trajectory that changed what I thought about education, especially literacy education, and in turn helped me evaluate the priorities and possibilities for a more equitable education in Australia. So I'd like to begin today with Milani's concept of I Gianni e Pierino, which we know Pierino is a metaphor for the children of those who enjoy economic, cultural, and social capital. And Gianni represents the children whose lives do not align with the practices that are valued in schools. Gianni non sapere mettere l'H al verbo avere, ma del mondo dei grandi sapere tante cose, del lavoro, delle famiglie, della vita del paese. Gianni didn't know how to conjugate the verb to have, but he knew many things about the world, about work, family, and life in the village. So I'd like to think of Gianni and Pierino in the Australian context. In Australia, neoliberalism has gained traction, particularly through the marketisation of education, the accountability agenda, and standardised testing. Educational achievement is very much narrowed down to achievement in literacy and to a lesser degree numeracy. And extensive literature exists in this field by academics such as Michael Apple, Alan Reid, Stephen Ball, and Pasi Salzberg. But speaking more generally, Australia performs well in most dimensions measured by the OECD economic surveys. So, for example, Australians have above average income, above average employment. The health care in Australia is fairly high when we compare it across the globe, as is education. Now, you can look at these statistics and think that Australia or Australian education is cruising along quite well. But when we examine the data a little bit more closely, we can really see that Australia is divided into the Gianni and Pierinos. National testing in literacy and numeracy consistently shows that testing results are inextricably linked to socioeconomic status. That is, your address will help to determine your academic outcome. Education in Australia favours Pierino, whose out-of-school literacy practices align with the practices expected, encouraged and nurtured in schools. Now, those students with cultural capital have a greater statistical chance of advantageous educational outcomes. So, for example, students who live in the city fare much better than those who live in the country. Students from rural and remote areas show up in the data as poor achievers. And students from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds are significantly below their non-Indigenous peers. So despite Australia's economic capital, disparities exist. And while Australia persists with its narrow view of education, limited to these achievements in literacy and numeracy, I think that these disparities will continue to exist. Now, access to the language of schooling equates to access to academic English. Now, Milani recognised the advantage for those whose language was valued at school. He saw language as a means of inclusion, but also as a weapon of marginalisation. Voi dite che Pierino del Dottore scrive bene. Per forza, parla come voi. Appartiene alla ditta. You say Pierino, son of the doctor, writes well. Of course he does. He speaks like you. He belongs to the firm. Australia is a multicultural nation, but English dominates, and the acceptance of plurilingualism is in its infancy. Pierino, Milani tells us, è fortunato perché sa parlare, disgraziato perché parla troppo, lui che ha nulla di importante da dire. Pierino knows how to speak, but speaks too much and has nothing important to say. Now, as a society, if we want to prosper, if we want to focus on citizenship and value humanity and inclusion, then we need to knock down the institutional barriers that continue to block those whose out-of-school practices differ to those in schools. And this includes the way that we use a language. We need to listen beyond those whose lives are like us. We need to hear different voices, and we need the process of education, particularly literacy education, that holds text central as a means of listening and hearing. Milani argued that la lingua fa uguale, language creates equality. And this indeed is true, but in Australia, rather than the notion of one English, the notion of many Englishes challenges our thinking. And as mentioned, we are at the beginning of this interesting educational journey, and really much remains to be done in this space. Related to language is culture, and Milani had a lot to say about culture. He saw culture as human experience and recognised that one's culture is not inferior to another, but rather it's diverse. La cultura non è inferiore, è diversa. Now, here in the Australian context, I turn our attention to Australia's first people, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Like many First Nations people across the globe, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to suffer the legacy of colonisation. Australia has a brutal and violent history against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and one that has been left out of education. Now, why is this the case? Well, perhaps it's due to settler fear of blame. Perhaps it's due to fearing compensation, whether that's in the terms of money terms or in terms of the return of land to First Nations people. And perhaps it's just due to ignorance. Australia's history is embroiled with ideals of racial superiority, eugenics, with massacres, slavery, and government politics that resulted in the removal of children from families. And this later point, the removal of Aboriginal children, continues to occur right into the 1970s. So I'm speaking about history, but really not too distant history. And this stolen generation that we have here in Australia, many would argue that continues to happen because of the way that we are socially structured. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today make up only about 3% of the population. So it is entirely possible that many Australians live their lives without any interaction, personal interaction with First Nations people. And this makes it very easy to erase history. It makes it very easy to erase people, and it makes very easy to erase the uncomfortable truths from the past and the present. Now, small steps have been taken in recent times for curriculum recognition of First Nations people. The Australian curriculum, which has been used in educational institutions for about 11 years now, has a new version that came out last year, version 9, released last year and aimed to enhance First Nations content. The curriculum states that it focuses on deepening students' understanding of First Nation Australian histories and cultures, the impact on and the perspectives of First Nations Australians, the arrival of British settlers, as well as First Nations contributions to the building of modern Australia. Now, these curriculum enhancements align with Australia's educational goals expressed in the Alice Springs or Mawatni Declaration that calls for all students to learn about the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and address the goal of positive outcomes for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Now, additionally, the curriculum enhancements speak to the Australian professional standards for teachers that require Australian teachers to have knowledge of First Nations history and culture. Now, this sounds very positive, doesn't it? Curriculum inclusion, we have teaching standards, we have Australian goals for education. It sounds very positive, and it is positive. However, when a nation has had over 200 years of erasing First Nations people, it's a little naive to think that simple additions to the curriculum will address decades of the hidden past. Now, for all educators, the teaching of literacy provides an avenue for the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. And this puts a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of teachers, and I think rightly so. And Milani addresses teachers saying, doveste veder chiaro. teachers, you need to see clearly. Again, this is a fair point, but it must be understood that Australian education has not supported learning about First Nations history or culture. Until recently, textbooks have taken a terra nullius approach, which positioned the British as discovering Australia, wiping away 65,000 years of culture, people, connection to country that existed on this island prior to British settlement. Now, my PhD studies illuminated the lack of knowledge that teachers held in this space, but also their lack of confidence. And these findings are replicated in current research, including research that I'm involved in across 2 Australian states, showing that teachers recognise the importance of cultural inclusion, but lack the knowledge and confidence to teach Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. And when they do take this leap into teaching, then they choose a safe option and choose to share cultural stories rather than stories of truth-telling about Australia's difficult past. So we like to, to stay in this safe space that makes everyone feel good. So what is the solution here? Well, obviously education, and education across a lifetime. This is not something that can be remain just in the primary or secondary sectors. It has to be something that as Australians we adopt across our lifetime. Universities have begun to introduce First Nations studies presented by First Nations people as core components of teacher education courses. And although in its infancy, scholars have begun to discuss ways that the Australian curriculum can be decolonised. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices are being published in rich text that tells stories of country, community, history, language and culture. And some of these texts are even published as bilingual texts, resurrecting some of these languages that have been lost. These texts are finding their ways into schools and into the hands of teachers who are willing to take the political challenge of addressing some of these really big issues. Come le fa paura andare al fondo, said Milani. How frightening it is to go deep. And indeed it is, but absolutely necessary. Some of the texts written by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people share cultural stories. Some include First Nations characters or present the achievements and contributions of First Nations people, bringing to the foreground people who previously would have been obscured. And some tackle head-on issues important to First Nations people and therefore should be important to all Australians. These texts prioritise truth-telling and reconciliation. Some of these texts can be used even with the youngest children in their first years of formal schooling. These texts are vital for the teachers of literacy. Milani accused teachers of using textbooks but ignoring issues of significance. Nel vostro libro c'era tutto fuorché la fame, I monopoli, I sistemi politici e il razzismo. You look for everything in your books except hunger, monopolies, political systems and racisms. Now, he was referring to significant world issues of the time, including Italy's presence in Africa. But we can see that nearly 100 years on and across the other side of the globe, his observations and commentary still hold true. Different people, different times, but the same issues. Milani warned that if you don't educate your population, the fascists will. And I'm not sure that I would name fascism as a strong force in Australia, but certainly ignorance and apathy are, and I would argue that these are as dangerous. Now, you may be aware that Australians voted about 6 weeks ago. The vote was not to elect a political party, but it was a referendum to determine whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be recognised in the Constitution, to see if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should have a voice in Parliament to advise on matters relevant to First Nation Australians. And it really saddens my heart here, and I'm deeply embarrassed to announce in front of an international audience that Australians voted no. No. Now, why did Australians vote no? Well, firstly, there was a very effective conservative right-wing scare campaign based on misrepresentation and misinformation. Secondly, many Australians are just not politically aware and do not understand the Constitution or its role. And thirdly, some Australians did not like the idea of division, feeling that special rights for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would be unfair. And this point is coupled by research from the Australian National University and the work of Professor Biddle that shows that many Australians believe Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander disadvantage comes from their lack of effort. Now, by no means am I claiming that everyone who voted no is racist, but I can confidently say that every racist voted no. The research survey results that are available on the Australian National University's Centre for Social Research and Methods website shows that the vote was linked to education. No voters were more likely to be male, older, with low levels of education, living outside of cities, and living in low-income households. So this really has implications for how Australia moves forward, socially, culturally, and as a nation. And it reflects the 200 years or so since British settlement, which actively worked to erase Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Ogni popolo ha sua cultura e nessun popolo ne meno di un altro. Every population has its culture and none is less than another. Education, as determined by the Australian National University study into the no vote, was defined by years of formal schooling. That is, years of studies linked to an educational institution. Now, although Australia has had significant success in increasing the rate of secondary schooling completion, there is attrition of students as they go up the levels and into university. This is something that I suppose is observed globally and something that Milani himself observed and recognised as a detrimental factor impacting upon a nation's education. And it's in this space that Australia is yet to think differently. How can we educate a population that does not commit all people to years of institutionalised education? Now, at the moment, housing, employment, the cost of living, these are all factors combining to make years of institutional education impossible for some. But opportunities do exist that can open up pathways for education in non-institutions, for example, sporting clubs, community groups, local libraries. These can all be utilised for education and for education across a lifetime. So let me just take stock for one moment and recap the content that I've tried to cover so far. So I've tried to establish that Australia, although a prosperous country, holds skewed degrees of equity. Gianni and Pierino are very real. We've also explored language and culture and illustrated how these are factors that support education and in turn are also supported by education. but only when your language and culture match that of the school. We then turned our attention to a marginalised group in Australia, the First Nations people, or Australia's Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, and saw that despite curriculum inclusion and policy support, teachers lack knowledge and confidence in teaching First Nations perspective and avoid dealing with difficult knowledge. And finally, we considered some areas for future possibility that can create pathways for education, areas that have not yet been thought about in the political arena, but nonetheless exist and hold dormant possibilities. So in the final few minutes, I'd like us to think specifically about literacy and the role that it plays in a socially just education. I've already mentioned the centrality of text in education and the affordances that text can bring for the listening and hearing of diverse voices. People need to be empowered to question, to interrogate text, to come to text with a critical literacy lens, and ask, why has this text been written or created? And what is the creator of this text trying to make me think or feel? And do I agree? Is this a position that I wish to adopt, or am I going to push against it? Now, this type of thinking is not one that is overtly present in the Australian curriculum. Critical literacy, critical pedagogy is a hot potato, really, but it's not entirely absent either. And teachers who prioritise critical pedagogy, critical literacy, and or culturally inclusive pedagogy can make pedagogical choices that support students to interrogate text. Milani supported this type of pedagogical approach that promoted critical thinking and student agency, especially through the deconstruction and reconstruction of media, such as newspapers. He selected texts such as the writings of Gramsci, Gandhi, the Gospels, and teachers' text selection is a political act. Australian teachers can also act politically through text selection and consider texts that bring to the foreground First Nations voices. Critically reading texts involves a focus on the power of words, and Milani knew this and spent time with his students studying vocabulary, studying the way that oral language works and the way that written language works. He also apprenticed his students in dialogue and debate so that they developed not just the skills needed for discourse, but the confidence to challenge ideas, as was seen in La Conferenza del Venerdì. So with regards to dialogue, Milani used talk as a pedagogical tool. Dialogue was at the core of his pedagogy. And here, through dialogic practices, Milani was able to capture the power of the collective, where students could learn from and with the teacher, and from and with each other. This power of the collective was also captured through collective writing. The reciprocity of the modes, the reciprocity of oral language, reading and writing, formed the basis of his instruction, alongside critical thinking and relevant discussions that held significance for his students. The teaching of literacy in Australia in more recent years has lent into a greater focus on discrete skills. And with a current teacher shortage that we have, and the awareness that teacher workload, educational systems are looking for pre-packaged lesson plans. They're looking for scripted lessons and they're looking for commercialised programs. Standardised testing and the accountability regime have prioritised prioritised individual gains especially in discrete skills which can be easily measured. You know, we can tick off and show that how we're progressing. This can and has led to systems that encourage individualism and systems that encourage competition rather than capturing the power of the collective for thinking, as Milani did. So the current neoliberalism conceptualization of literacy is supported by many cognitive scientists who are influential at the moment in Australia, and who see literacy as a set of discrete measurable skills. Now, this conceptualization divorces language and literacy from its context, and in doing so removes the possibility of literacy to be synonymous with human experience. Now, in my role as a teacher educator and a provider of professional learning for in-service teachers in Australia, I'm going to continue to use literacy as the vehicle to address equality, to use literacy as a way to reduce marginalisation, to ensure that I hear unheard voices, especially the voices of First Nations people. These voices have been silenced or ignored for way too long. And I do this because I am absolutely inspired by the teachings of Milani and see these reflected in the work of dedicated teachers every day. Teachers who conceptualise literacy as a complex, multifaceted phenomenon, one that links us through thought, language, and experience. And so I end my discussion today with two words, the words that Milani painted in giant letters on the walls of his school in Barbiani. He painted them in English, I care. And these words I see reflected in the actions of teachers. And I can feel them even as we gather here today, you know, to celebrate the legacy of a priest, a pedagogue, a philosopher, a rebel, and a teacher. I care, and I know that you care, and that's why we're here celebrating this great man. And so my hope and prayers are for the good work of Don Lorenzo Milani to live on through our work, the work of our colleagues, and the work of all involved in education. So thank you very much for listening to me from, you know, across the other side of the world. It's been a pleasure to address you today.
Thank you very much, Helen Roddens. Very inspiring and very, you know, the actual relevance and resonance of Don Milani and his works. You also made reference to La Conferenza del Venerdì, which precedes Barbiana, because it's not always Barbiana, but especially in the session where we are the global UNESCO Global Chair in Adult Education, we must give a lot of importance to San Donato de Calenzano, where he probably did most of his youth and adult education work, although Barbiana was also, as you know, and as Eduardo will tell us, was a community school. Anybody could attend. I mean, adults from the community, of course, community could be a small hamlet, which is Barbiana, but they could come up with motorcycles from other parts along the mountain, okay, from Vicchio upwards. They could go there. Anybody could attend the school as long as you participate and you contribute wherever you have relevant expertise. I mean, the first thing that Don Milani, everybody says about Don Milani, those who lived at the time he was very active, is you are never there as a guest just to listen, but if you have a certain specialization, ti metterà subito al lavoro. He'll put you to work. Okay, everybody says that. You look at some of the documentaries on Rai television, which could be accessed on YouTube. There's a lot of work on YouTube. TG3, Speciale TG1, etc., etc. Lots of documentaries, and I learned a lot of things about Milani, not from books, but even from those documentaries. I mean, people always say whenever he goes there, somebody goes there, a journalist, because he captured the imagination. The press was all about it. He would put the press to work. Okay, teach them something about photography if you're a photographer, etc., etc. So this is interesting. Now, not to keep, because I know it's very late for Helen. I can see Daniel Shugorensky on. Daniel, hola.
Hola.
I will pass now from Australia to North America. Daniel
Sure,
is
Peter.
is an Argentinian. He's very happy because his country won the World Cup. He is also of Ukrainian origin, so he's very, I'm sure he's not going through a very good time right now. But he also straddles United States and Canada. We met, Daniel and I, at the University of Alberta, where I had never heard of Don Milani then. He probably did, and because he read him in high school. And Daniel, are you ready to go?
Yes, I sent my presentation to Joseph about an hour ago. I don't know if he was able to open it.
I'm sure Joe is going to open it. Hola,
Can
Joe.
share, or if you can share.
Yeah, there you are.
Yeah, first one. Yeah. So thank you, Peter, and thank you, the University of Malta, and thank you, Helen, for your presentation. So
Let me just introduce you. Daniel Shugorensky is quite a well-known person. He wouldn't want me to say this in comparative education, and particularly in sociology of education, from widely published from Buenos Aires originally, and he is at the University of Arizona State University in the United States. But before that, he was at UCLA, and he was also at Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and also taught before when he was still a student, I think, at the University of Alberta, and even afterwards. So, Daniel, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Helen, for your presentation, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. So my presentation is called From the School We Have to the School We Want, Lessons from the Barbiana School. So basically, I will try to see what can we learn from the Barbiana School and from Milani, and I will tell you a little bit about some things we are doing here in Arizona. So Joseph, if you can move forward, please, to the next slide. So the Barbiana School, as you know, started in 1954 and lasted until 1967 when Don Milani passed away. And anyway, I will tell you now the outline of my presentation very quickly. I'm not sure if I'm going to go next one. Yeah. First, I will start, as Peter said, with a biographical note of how I met Barbiana in high school. Then I met Lorenzo Milani in Canada through Peter Mayo. Then the second part will be a little bit about the Barbiana School. And the third part will be about what can be done now in the mainstream education system. And I will talk a little bit about the project that we have here in Arizona. Okay, next. So in the 70s, I was a teenager in Argentina. That's me with my dog in Argentina in the early 70s. And here is actually an image of the movie, The Official Story, which was shot in the high school where I went to school in the 70s. And at that time, I had a classmate called Carlos Vaney, and he gave me the book, Lettera a una professoressa, that was published in Italian in 1967, and it was published in Spanish in the 70s. So we can go to next. And you can see the difference. My school was a very horrible building. That was my school, Urquiza. And you can compare with the Barbiana school, much nicer environment. Yeah. So that was the school. Yeah. And then here you can see the first edition in Italian, Lettera a una professoressa. And you can see that Don Milani does not appear in any of these editions. Yeah, it seems that the Barbiana school are the Scuola di Barbiana are the authors. So if we move next to the Spanish version, you can see different editions in Spanish in the early 70s, and not the authors of the book in Spanish. It says, alumnos de la Escuela de Barbiana, estudiantes de la Escuela de Barbiana, and the third one, alumnos de la Escuela de Barbiana. So when I accessed this book through my friend Carlos Vaney in the early 70s, when I was in high school, I was about 15 or 16 years old, I never made the connection between the Barbiana school and Lorenzo Milani. To me, there was a teacher, there was a magical teacher that played some role somewhere, but the authors, to me, of the book were the children of Barbiana, the students of Barbiana. And you can see in this slide, the first page, in English, it says also related to a school by the school boys of Barbiana. You can see the authorship here. And here it says on the back cover, 8 young Italian boys from the mountains of South Florence wrote this book, blah, blah, blah. They set out to show the ways, etc. So a third person, plural, about the 8 Italian boys, collective voice of the school children. No mention of Milani here. Continue. So if you see the first page of the book, in the one I accessed in Spanish, it says, at first glance, it looks like it was written by one boy. However, the authors are 8 kids from the school of Barbiana. Other classmates who are working also helped us on Sunday. And then in the next paragraph, they say, we need to give thanks to our priest. And then also to some friends and to parents and to this and this and that. So there was no mention of Lorenzo Milani. To me, the name Lorenzo Milani was still unknown at that time, because to me it was the students, and there was some teacher there that helped them, a priest. So, and to me, I was fascinated by these kids writing this book that I read it carefully at that time. So can we go to the next one? It's about the book. So this book to me was very interesting because it was really a book about sociology of education through the narrative of these children, and the 2 main characters, Pierino and Gianni, you know, the upper class kid and the working class kid, and the book really deals with important concepts of sociology of education. It deals about the conversions between economic capital, cultural capital, and social capital, and these mechanisms of conversion 2 decades before Pierre Bourdieu wrote The Forms of Capital. So to me, it was very interesting to see this analysis of the kids about how these conversions occurred in the context of Italy without even knowing Pierre Bourdieu yet. Next. Then fast forward to the 80s, I was in the 70s. Fast forward to the 80s, and in the 80s, I meet my friend Peter Mayo in the University of Alberta, and I made a connection. He told me about Lorenzo Milani and Barbiana, and then I said, oh, it's the same person, it's the same school, it's the same book. So I made the connection between Barbiana and Milani, but before, to me, what Barbiana was one thing, Milani didn't exist. So thanks to Peter Mayo in the 80s, I made the connection. Oh, this is the guy behind these 8 kids who wrote the book. Okay, next. So we have I learned about Milani, and to me it was interesting later on when I was in Canada, working in adult education, that Milani was sent to exile, quotation marks, in Barbiana by the leadership of the church that saw him as a rebel. And it was like a Plutarch, you know, a parallel life with Moses Cody, who in Canada also was sent to exile in Antigonish, in Nova Scotia, because he was a rebel, thinking that in these remote areas they would be, you know, doing will be no risk for the church. And in these places, isolated places like Antigonish or Barbiana, these 2 educators developed made important contributions to the field of education. Moses Cody, the connection between cooperativism and adult education, and Milani, the contributions of the Barbiana School. So let's continue. So you can see here Milani with the students, continue, more Milani with the students, continue. Yeah, Milani and his students, Milani. You see there was a table, there was not a classroom, there was no blackboard, there was a teacher and the students, you know, around the table, and sometimes very few books. Continue. Lots of outdoors, yeah, and continue. So Milani said, we will not see saints blossom until we have built young people who vibrate with pain and faith while thinking about social injustice. So these ideas that he had about connecting education to social justice. Okay, continue. So very quickly, you already know this probably, so we'll go very quick on this. Some of the features of the Barbiana School that serve as inspiration for us today. The first is the denunciations of the schools we have. So the children in that book did an analysis of the role of the schools in reinforcing social inequalities and what we just mentioned about the conversion between economic capital, social capital, cultural capital, etc. And the issue of class mainly in the reinforcing of social inequalities. Second characteristic was student-centered. So the children and youth were the protagonists of the school, and you can see in the book how the book was written by the children. And me as a teenager, I couldn't even see the figure of Milani there. So even the book, the children were the protagonists. The curriculum should be relevant, you know. So it was problem-based learning and project-based learning based on real problems in the community, involving the community. The fourth is critical pedagogy. He encouraged students to think critically, engaging them in discussions about economic, social, and political issues, particularly in the context of Italy. A fifth feature was empowerment. So the idea was to foster a sense of agency, especially among the poor rural children in Italy. Continue. The number 6 feature is a personalized education. So the Barbiana School tailored education to the needs and interests of individual students to foster a love of learning. So students came to Barbiana with different backgrounds, different levels of reading and writing and math and so on. So the Barbiana School was adapting the content to the particular needs of the students with a mentorship program that was very interesting. And that's number 7, which is peer mentoring. So students in Barbiana helped each other and that nurtures solidarity among them. Number 8 is community participation that Peter Mayo alluded to before, that the Barbiana School involved the local community in the educational process and connected the content with community realities, making it more impactful. And number 9, there was no grading in the Barbiana School. So Milani argued that the traditional grading seldom reflects the students' understandings and abilities and often perpetuate the inequalities, and that appears also in the book. So, as a summary of the Barbiana School, I would say that there was an alternative educational model to the mainstream school system, emphasized social justice, equity, critical thinking, solidarity, and community engagement, and is a proud member of a family of alternative progressive schools. It was not the first one, was not the last one, but it was an important contribution of a family of alternative progressive schools. And I would like to highlight here the word alternative. Yeah. So if we can go to the next one, you can see some of these traditions, some of the examples of this tradition of alternative school, starting from Tolstoy, yeah, and going to the Escuela Moderna of Ferrer y Guardia, Montessori, de Crowley, Gandhi, Emma Goldman, also with the modern school of Ferrer y Guardia in New York, and so on and so forth. Summerhill, Lepeczynski, yeah, Pistrak. You see Korczak and Gorky Makarenko, yeah, the Freinet with the newspaper, the student newspaper, and Barbiana School fits there in that tradition. And the point I want to make here is that these alternative schools serve as inspiration and aspiration, but have a limited impact in terms of scale. So can we go to the next one? So these alternative schools that I mentioned and many others that we can find around the world are often outside of the mainstream education system. They have a relative high degree of autonomy for different reasons. They could be private, or they could be isolated, or could be different reasons can lead to the autonomy. They usually have innovative approaches. They are inspiration for us, for progressive educators around the world, but, and this is my point, it had limited impact in terms of scale. So my question is, what can we do? How can we use this inspiration, these features from the Barbiana School and other schools from this tradition in the public school sector? What can we do in the public school sector that is more reluctant to, or more impermeable to progressive policies and programs? So next. Oh, yeah, so I will provide just one example of something we're doing here in Arizona with a team that we have here. There are many other examples, but this is one example that we are using the inspiration from Barbiana in a program that we're doing in the public system in Arizona with all the challenges and the possibilities that this implies. So let's go this participatory, school participatory budgeting. For example, this is a toolkit that we did for inclusive practice of participatory budgeting in schools. I am the director of the Participatory Governance Initiative that appears at the bottom, and we work together with a nonprofit called the Center for the Future of Arizona. So continue. So the idea is the virtuous circle thesis, that there is a virtuous relationship between participatory democracy and citizenship learning, because one builds the other. So more participatory democracy, more democratic learning, and more democratic learning, a better quality of democracy. Continue. So participatory budgeting is a democratic process in which community members decide how to spend a portion of the public budget. Very straightforward definition. Started in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in 1989, and now there are more than 11,000 cities doing participatory budgeting. The sociologist Eric Olin Wright, in his book Real Utopias, he mentioned participatory budgeting as one of the examples of real utopias. Later on, we can talk about Eric's thesis in that book if you want. And the school participatory budgeting is an adaptation of this democratic process of deliberation and decision-making from the municipal sphere to school settings. So in this translation from the municipal realm to the educational realm, there is a more emphasis, more intentional emphasis on the pedagogical dimension of the process. Continue. So the school participatory budgeting basically is at the same time a tool for citizenship education, for civic engagement, and for school democracy. Three things that connect with the Barbiana School. And so in terms of citizenship education, next. The mainstream model of citizenship education, at least in the United States, is very elitist, yeah? And basically citizenship education in elite schools is education for leadership, and in working class schools is education for followership. And then in terms of the pedagogy is the banking education model, particularly in mainstream Title I schools. We call it the schools of low-income students. And it's a transmission of information, in Freire banking education, memorization of dates, names, and places, allegiance to the nation state and standardized testing. All the opposite of what Barriana School was about. So the alternative model that the school participatory budgeting brings into this is experiential learning, Milani, John Dewey, and many others, learning democracy by doing. You can go back even to Rousseau about that, and problem-based and project-based learning, etc., etc. So in terms of civic engagement, the mainstream model is elitist. So there is a small elite group of students who participate in student government usually. So these are we call them the usual suspects, students who already had opportunities for leadership development, and they participate in student government or in special clubs, And the Matthew effect, that is the accumulation of disadvantages over time, advantages and disadvantages over time. So we can see the Matthew effect not only in the economy, but also in terms of political and civic participation. So in the mainstream model, you have also lots of tokenism and simulations and charity, this type of idea of civic engagement. And the students are seen as future citizens. In the alternative model, it has an inclusive approach. We want everybody in the school to participate in this process, not just a small group of students. These are real projects with real budgets, no simulations. And the students are seen as citizens of the present, not of the future. And finally, instead of school governance, the mainstream model of school governance is top-down hierarchical with the principal on top and the students at the bottom. And this alternative model proposes school democracy in which all the school community participates in deliberation and decision-making. And school participatory budgeting is the entry point. So I don't have much time to go into many details of how it works, but in the next slide, you can see how the process works through different phases. So the students start identifying needs in their school and propose ideas to address those problems. Then they translate those ideas into feasible projects. Then they deliberate about the different proposals. Then they vote, and then the winning projects are implemented. Next. Next. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here you can see the same process. First, the students design the process, they decide the rules of the game, then they brainstorm ideas, they develop the proposals, they deliberate, they vote, and the projects are implemented. Next. Another graphic of the project. Let's go to the next one. Next slide, please. So school participatory budgeting is growing around the world. You can see some of the countries in which school PB, we call it, is being implemented, from Argentina to Zambia. There are about 20 countries doing now school PB, and this is just a sample of countries that are implementing school participatory budgeting, sometimes in dozens of schools, sometimes in the whole country, like in the case of Portugal. Next. In Arizona, now let's finish with my own work here with my team here in Arizona. Arizona was the place of the first school PB in the United States in 2013. One of my students was a principal of a school, and he implemented it with his discretionary budget. And since then, it has expanded to over 70 schools, 9 school districts involving 70,000 students every year. And we also have done 6,000 new voter registrations, which is important because voting is not mandatory in the US, and you need to be registered to vote. So we work mainly in low-income schools with students of color and indigenous students. So those are the students who are less likely to participate, to vote, and to register to vote. Phoenix Union is an interesting example because they have been doing this process in all their schools, 22 schools, for many years. And in 2020, they did not renew the contract with the police for police on campus, and they reallocated $1.2 million that was previously allocated to the police to students, parents, teachers, and staff to decide together in a participatory budgeting process how to ensure school safety without necessarily using police on campus, called school resource officers. Very interesting process. And one of my students, Tara Bartlett, just wrote her doctoral dissertation on this process. So we do process evaluation and impact evaluation. So for impact evaluation of the school participatory budgeting in the schools, we use 4 main indicators for civic and political learning and change. So we call it CASP, civic and political knowledge, civic and political attitudes and values, civic and political skills, and civic and political practices. So we have about 10 indicators for each variable, and we look at the changes that happen with students who participate in this process over time with these 40 indicators, including political efficacy, including deliberative skills, interest for the common good, etc., etc. And then we have 10 indicators for school climate, which have to do with the democracy, school democracy indicators. We have about 10 indicators for that. So this is our theory of change. I'm not going to go into that because it's a very busy slide, but basically we have a theory of change. What is the problem? We have the civic engagement gap that we talked about, yeah? And then we talk about the context, the input, the strategy, and the impact and the outcomes. So later on, if we have time during the Q&A, I can talk more about the theory of change, but basically we argue that through school participatory budgeting, we can nurture citizenship learning, civic engagement, and school democracy. Next. So this is a superintendent in Phoenix Union, Phoenix Union was the first district in the country to do school participatory budgeting. And we have a video. I'm not going to have time to show the video, but in the video he said, to teach kids the process is one thing. Oh, sorry. Can we go back? To teach the process is one thing, but to engage them and have them lead the process is another thing. And the students lead the process in this case. Next. So you have another quote from the video. Yeah? One student said, now I understand so much more about how school relates to the district and how our funding and facilities improvements work and how can I make a difference there. Because the school participatory budgeting is about making a difference in the school community and eventually in the city. Next, this is the Maricopa County Recorder, who's now has a different position in the state of Arizona. And he said this is really important because it empowers students and it teaches them about the importance of civic engagement in a way that actually impact them. And they bring the machines, the actual machines that are used in the actual voting to demystify the voting process. Next. So you can see now the summary of the engagement of the schools in Arizona. Yeah. So students learn democracy by doing through advocacy and improvement projects in their campuses. Yeah. It builds stronger communities and develops students who are more informed, equipped, and empowered to participate in civic life, and creates a pipeline of civic leaders who are trained to be problem solvers, innovators, and thinkers. And we pay particular attention, as I said, to schools that are called Title I schools that have a high enrollment of low-income students, racialized students, indigenous students, and also we, in the process, we give more opportunities to take leadership positions to students with disabilities. So we have an inclusive approach. Next. I'm not going to show you the short video. If we have time, it's a 4-minute video, but I can give you the link and then you can watch it on yourself. Or you can just put school participatory budgeting will be video, and it will be one of the first videos you can see. Next. Next slide, please. You have a quote from one of the students in the video.
Next slide.
Next slide, please.
Yeah.
So one of the students who said she never voted for anything in her life, and she was a Latina high school student, and she said in the video, when I get older, I still want to be seeing what's wrong with my community, coming up with ways to fix it, and then acting upon it. That's what I like doing. I just never really got a chance to act upon it until now with participatory budgeting. So participatory budgeting, we see it as an entry point for students to start participating and to gain confidence, to gain agency, to work together, to work collaboratively, to address the issues in their community. So the summary, SPB enables students to be part of decision-making processes and how to allocate a part of the budget, enhances civic learning, agency, collaboration, and critical thinking, and it has a particular emphasis on equity and inclusion. And to finish, back to Milani, we will not see saints blossom until we have built young people who vibrate with pain and faith while thinking about social injustice. Reminds me the quote by Elder Câmara, the Bishop of Recife in Brazil, who said, when I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why are they poor, they call me a communist. So thank you very much. Next one is my email. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Muchas gracias.
Oh,
Fantastic.
sorry, I had the extra slide, because I had 3 more minutes. I just used 10 seconds to say to Spain. In Spain, there is a movement called the Movimiento de Educadores Milanianos, and they started in Salamanca in 71, and brings educators who are interested in pursuing and enacting the ideas of Milani. That's it. Thank you.
We wanted to bring a very good friend of mine who was at the heart of that movimiento de Educadores Milanianos, Jorge Corso Toral, but he has health problems, and right now he's undergoing checks, etc., in hospital, and could not participate, much to his regret. Daniel, before I open for the floor, I want to correct 1 or 2 things. Okay, the host asked me to start my video. Okay, 2 things, just a correction, nothing special. Memory plays tricks on us. We are now getting old, Daniel. You were obviously referring to, you said that I introduced you to Milani when we were students in Alberta in the late 80s. Well, that couldn't be the case, because I had not heard of Don Milani before 1989, and we were there 87, 88. So I must have mentioned him to you later, either when you came to Malta to teach, or when we met at comparative education conferences, or when I gave a talk about Milani in Toronto, when you were at OISE. Because in 1989, I got to know about a person called Don Lorenzo Milani. I had studied Freire, you know, and Gramsci, and there was a film, one of the films, 3 films made about Don Milani. It was in color. I forgot who the actor was, not the recent one. The recent one was with Castelletti as the main actor. And he opened up with a piece from, I believe it's from L'ubbidienza non è più una virtù, when obedience is no longer a virtue. And I said, my God, this sounds like Freire to me. And I was enthralled. And from then onwards, I started getting interested in Don Milani. Second thing is,
so location and time was wrong, but the person was right. You were the one.
Well, maybe, but you know something, and maybe interesting. This is interesting. Don Milani himself was on his deathbed. He was dying. He died very young, Hodgkin's disease. But he was directing the project from his deathbed. Don Milani was not interested in degrees or things like that. He never wanted to go to university, which was taken for granted in his family. But he had a sense of progettualità. And he wanted the students to be directed, and it has to be their work. Don Milani deliberately kept himself out of it. However, there are other books by Don Milani, one in particular, which is his masterpiece, which has not been translated into English, which is called Esperienze Pastorali. And that's a book that is his masterpiece. Now, that book was banned by the church because he was criticizing the whole idea of the institution. And then, of course, Pope John XXIII, who was the Bishop of Venice, which banished the church very unrigorously because he hadn't read the book, but based his decision, I learned this now in Bergamo, the conference, on a recensione, on a review, which was una stroncatura, an attack on Don Milani. Is a divisive person. Now, that book is probably influential in Vatican Council too. So John the 23rd actually recanted from that position and took a different position. Not
And
just
Pope Francis went to Barbiana.
Yes, I know. The problem with Pope Francis, who I am very much in favor of, I mean, he's a breath of fresh air in that institution of Constantinian church called the Vatican. The worst thing for me, now people are going to hate me for this, is he wants to turn him into a saint. And that, I think, is the worst thing he can do to Don Milani, because he will sanitize his whole idea. That's my opinion. However, in that book, Esperienze Pastorali, and this answers the question, how do we apply? You don't apply, you have to reinvent, as you know, from Paulo Freire. Well, Don Milani says, La Scuola di Barbiana was born in Barbiana and ended in Barbiana. You cannot transpose it. It is a particular set of circumstances which come together. However, he says, many people in Esperienza Pastorale, he says, many people ask me, how do you do schooling? Fare scuola in Italian, translated literally. And he said, they make a mistake. That's a gross mistake. That's the wrong question. Sbagliano domanda. Dovevano dimandare come si potrebbe essere per poter far scuola. How must you be to create schooling? So it's about being. It's not about, having any skills. And this relates to the idea that the basic idea is your orientation, your attitude, your motivation. But then, as Daniel showed us, it is the context itself which conditions. I never use the word determines. I don't like that word, because it throws away agency. It conditions the way you shape your project. So it's like the folk high schools. The folk high schools in Denmark is one thing, but the folk high school in Tanzania is another, because the conditions are different, but the attitude is right. Paulo Freire makes the same statement. Experiments cannot be transplanted, they must be reinvented. And I think we have to keep that in mind, which I'm sure is what we do, listening to Helen and also listening to Danielle, the way you go about constructing. And hopefully one day, maybe, the idea of a participatory budget. I wrote a lot about the schools as community learning centers, how to transform. Till now, it's only been written. It was always stop-starts when they start something. You can't treat something like this, just tokenistic to do it. I hope in Malta we will develop this. This is my way of reinterpreting Paulo Freire, of reinterpreting Barbiana, but I need others. It's not just my way. Schooling is not just one person. Schooling should be everybody's concern. I hope one day we'll reach that, but we have to break away from the technical rational fix to do that. Questions and answers now for everybody. Go ahead. Thank you very much, Helen and Daniela, for your inputs. So, who's going to make the first comment? Well, I did, but from now onwards.
May I ask a question to Helen?
You have to ask me that? You have to ask that? Okay, go ahead.
First of all, thanks for the talk. Both thank you and thank Danielle. But I would like to specific with you, because I was very interested in the fact that I mean, in Australia, there seems to be a repeat of a pattern. So you have, I mean, people within higher institutions who are, okay, they introduce very much initiatives in relation to First Nations in your case and the like. But then, out of people in the street, when it comes to, when it really matters, they vote the other way. Could it be that ultimately because, I mean, I'm speaking, I'm obviously, could it be that ultimately these are just, I mean, our initiatives at the end of the day are, okay, they are just, they are nice, interesting, helpful, whatever, but they are just niche things, which, I mean, they are good in themselves, but ultimately they are niche things and we are failing, we are losing out the ability to communicate with people in the streets, many of whom ultimately, I mean, they wouldn't have gained anything ultimately from a referendum. It's built just out of fear that we are unable to build an alliance of communication with that constituency. I don't know whether it's
Yeah,
clear
no,
what
no. I
I
mean,
mean.
I think, Michael, you raised some really important points here. Obviously, there was that element of fear. There's an underlying undercurrent of racism, but I think that if we look at it from the lens of humanity, we're talking about a group of people who exist in Australia where mainstream Australians disregard. And that's something that has to change. You know, anyone who's interested in equity or in inclusion needs to change that way of thinking. And I think because, as I mentioned, you know, it's only 3% of the population that are Indigenous. For many Australians, out of sight, out of mind. But that has to change. That has to change. And I think also the other thing that's particularly interesting about Australia, unlike many other countries, is that we live a relatively comfortable life. We haven't had the social issues, even in politics, that have happened across the other side of the world. We have pretty much a two-party preferred system. Whether you are Labor, whether you are Liberal, your lifestyle for mainstream Australia doesn't change. So people are not invested in politics. They've got, you know, well, my standard of living doesn't really change, whether it's this government or this government, you know, it's not too much of a difference for me. But while mainstream Australia thinks in this way, we have Indigenous Australians whose health is severely compromised, whose years of living, infantile mortality, all of these issues here in a country that is prosperous like Australia still goes on. And that is an issue that has to be addressed. This is where you want to take, you know, Australians by the shoulders and shake them and say, wake up, you know. Just because you are living a comfortable life does not mean everyone is living a comfortable life. And a humanitarian society needs to address that. And because in education, we have not supported for decades, up until this point, we have not supported understanding First Nations people, we don't care. But that has to change, in my opinion.
Can I ask a question to Helen?
Yes.
Yeah, I was very intrigued, very interested in your work in teacher education. My question is, as I become older, I become more impatient about how we make actual changes in the school system. So my question is, do you have any way to know what are your students doing when they become teachers? Because I assume that you do more pre-service, sometimes in-service teaching. So how do they translate what they learn in your courses and the courses of other instructors at the university in when they become teachers in the schools?
Yes, so I think that in terms of the First Nations perspective, we're still very early days. This is only at the University of Melbourne. This is the second year that a First Nations component has been part of the core component for pre-service teachers. and it's a major part. It's 25% of the work that they do in their first year. That coupled with the curriculum, the explicitness now in the curriculum and the standards, I think that this is a question that we'll be able to answer in a few years' time. But as I mentioned earlier on, what the other thing that is happening, and you see this in bookshops everywhere now, there are dedicated sections of First Nations texts, from picture storybooks written for the youngest of children to adult fiction and non-fiction. So this is quite, Michael's talking about the rest of the community. This is something that is starting to be seen in the community. We begin most meetings now with an acknowledgement of country, of sporting events starting this way. So it's slowly coming into non-educational events, and I think just too early to measure yet.
Is it different from New Zealand, for instance, the situation? With regard, for example, New Zealand, I have a feeling that the Maori population is historically has been much more, I don't know, will I dare say, visible and present in the political system. They talk about the Treaty of Waitangi, for example.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with New Zealand, Peter, other than to say that looking at curriculum documents from decades ago, you can see presence of Maori in those curriculum documents from a long time ago, where in Australia it didn't exist. So I think that, and again, I'm no expert at all. I don't really know much about New Zealand education, but I would say that they are a few steps ahead.
I also think the question of invisibility or rendered invisible. They're not invisible, but they are rendered invisible. People are not slaves, they are enslaved.
Yes.
It is also the case with settler colonialism in most parts of the world. And I would think also the situation right now in Gaza brings this to the fore, where you have a population which is always considered to be non-existent, terras nullus. I'm thinking of the Palestinian because apart from Ronald Sultan, who passed away, the other thing which is on my mind right now is the situation in the middle in Gaza. And historically, there has always been this attitude towards the Palestinians. This is not their land. This is if they did not exist. You listen to Netanyahu, we build this land from nothing upwards. And I wonder if this is a pattern, wherever you've had a history of settler colonialism. I don't know. Sort of the question of invisibility, of not being rendered, I mean, it goes back historically. Think of Latin America. Daniel is from Argentina. I mean, think of the way indigenous were looked at by the conquistadors, have no soul. That was the debate. Debate whether they had a soul or not. Not having a soul means they could be sent down to the pits with mercury to extract the gold and silver, which adorn most of our cities, or many of our cities today, the comforts we take for granted. I don't know.
No, the legacy, I mean, there's no doubt the legacy of colonialism across the globe has had incredible impact. But I think that we are at that cusp where we can start to reverse some of this thinking. And I really don't see how anyone can be involved in education and not address that.
Exactly.
It's and this is where Milani is so relevant, because that should be at the heart of the teacher.
Well, depending on I'm sure most of us here are on board with you on that. It depends because of our values. It depends what values you hold. I mean, it's a matter of values at the end of the day. I would like to think that everybody feels that way. A person is a person in its complex dimensions within a collectivity, as you said, and but I'm sure not everybody thinks that way, unfortunately. I mean, elitism is not to be underestimated in education. Daniel was explaining the typologies. That elitism is very, very present in many parts of the world. I've encountered it personally in my own dealings with people as who should be educated and who shouldn't. There is still that debate going on. I hate to say this in 2000 and, in the 21st century, but that's a reality. There's always going to be a reaction to any kind of reform you create by people who may pretend to be democratic, but are not. They feel that they're entitled to a special kind of education. I find it shocking. I can't get my head round to it, but I know why this happens, why I can't get round to it, is because of the education I received at postgraduate level outside my own country, thanks to Canada primarily. So that once that changed your whole perspective, your whole paradigm, but doesn't mean that everybody thinks the same way. That's why people vote conservative. That's why people, that's why you get elections of people like Orban or we had Bolsonaro before. Talking about the indigenous under Bolsonaro during COVID.
Yes.
I mean, so what? That was his answer. So what? Anyway, any other comment? I'm worried I'm not seeing Domenico Simeone online. Domenico, ci sei? I skipped my own presentation on the UNESCO chair. So what I suggest we do now, Joe, if Domenico gave up the ghost, is Domenico? Ah, ti vedo. Okay, unmute. Domenico? He's here. Unmute. Devi premere sul microfono.
Eccomi.
Ah, bentornato. Ok. Ok, Domenico, passiamo a lei. Io posso darti del tu, ma qui facciamo qui. Domenico is a professor at the University of La Sagra Cuore di Milano. He's an expert on Don Milani. He wrote a very good book, I would say a great book, on the early Don Milani, the Don Milani not of Barbiana, but the before Barbiana. So much more in terms of adult education, San Donato di Calenzano. And lui parlerà in italiano, he will speak in Italian. This is bilingual. Domenico, you have the floor. Not the floor, you have the screen. Okay.
Grazie per questo invito. Mi scuso con voi se solo adesso riesco a collegarmi e mi scuso anche
che ci sei.
Ma mi scuso anche se parlo in italiano, ma il mio inglese non è buono, quindi preferisco parlare in italiano. Vi ringrazio.
L'italiano è una delle due lingue ufficiali di questo progetto.
Bene. Grazie anche per questo invito. Sono molto contento che ci sia questa iniziativa in occasione del centenario della nascita di Don Lorenzo Milani. Devo dire che sono molte le iniziative che sono state promosse in questo periodo e devo dire che è importante che si parli di Don Milani, ma leggendo i testi di Don Milani. Troppo spesso leggiamo delle interpretazioni che cercano di annettere Don Milani alla propria idea. Io credo che sia invece importante mettersi in ascolto alla scuola di Don Milani. I suoi scritti sono ancora oggi molto provocatori. Come bene ha detto il suo padre spirituale, Don Raffaele Bensi, in una intervista nel lontano 1971, lui diceva: Don Lorenzo Milani, trasparente e duro come un diamante, doveva subito ferirsi e ferire. Ecco, io credo che ancora oggi lasciarsi toccare da questo diamante con il rischio di ferirsi può essere ancora oggi un'operazione salutare in grado di insegnarci l'arte del fare scuola e del dare la parola ai poveri. Allora rileggere gli scritti di Don Lorenzo Milani è un'esperienza, a mio avviso, formativa per il lettore, che, sollecitato dalle parole del priore di Barbiana, anche a volte provocatorie e paradossali, ma mai banali, è invitato a interrogarsi in profondità senza seguire le strade dell'ovvio alla ricerca della verità. Credo che una lettura attenta ci può permettere di entrare in quello che lo stesso Don Lorenzo Milani, in esperienze pastorali, chiamava il segreto pedagogico di Barbiana. Scriveva Don Milani in esperienze pastorali: spesso gli amici mi chiedono come faccio a fare scuola e come faccio ad averla piena. Insistono perché io scriva per loro un metodo, che io precisi i programmi, le materie, le tecniche didattiche. Sbagliano domanda. Non dovrebbero preoccuparsi di come bisogna fare per fare scuola, ma solo di come bisogna essere per fare scuola. Bisogna essere, aggiungeva. Non si può spiegare in 2 parole come bisogna essere. Ma finite di leggere questo libro, si riferiva a esperienze pastorali, e poi forse capirete come bisogna essere per fare scuola. Ma poi aggiungeva: bisogna avere idee chiare in fatto di problemi sociali e politici, non bisogna essere interclassisti ma schierati, bisogna ardere dall'ansia di elevare il povero ad un livello superiore. Non dico a un livello pari a quello dell'attuale classe dirigente, ma superiore, più da uomo, più spirituale, più cristiano, più tutto. Ecco, qui in poche parole, a mio avviso, Don Lorenzo Milani condensa qual è anche il suo progetto educativo. Per Don Milani la scuola aveva come compito quello di eliminare il divario, la differenza tra chi aveva molte opportunità e chi invece rimaneva ai margini della società. Prima Peter faceva riferimento ai miei studi sulla prima esperienza di Don Lorenzo Milani, quella a San Donato di Calenzano, un'esperienza non molto studiata e approfondita, e secondo me a torto, perché quello che accadrà successivamente a Barbiana, e che noi conosciamo anche attraverso lettera a una professoressa, affonda le sue radici proprio in questa prima esperienza, quando il giovanissimo sacerdote Lorenzo Milani, giunto in questa parrocchia, si rende conto che non è possibile un'attività pastorale se non accompagnata da un'attività educativa, e apre una scuola popolare serale. A quell'epoca le scuole popolari erano state istituite dal Ministero per combattere l'analfabetismo di ritorno. Don Lorenzo Milani approfitta di questa iniziativa per proporre anche nella sua parrocchia una scuola popolare, dove raduna i giovani operai che alla sera si riunivano con lui per fare scuola, per prendere certo un diploma che poteva servire loro per trovare un lavoro migliore, per prendere la patente, per avere molte opportunità, ma soprattutto per affrontare i problemi della vita. È una scuola, quella di San Donato, che non si ferma al programma ministeriale, ma invece usa come libro di testo il quotidiano, usa come opportunità di incontro le conferenze del venerdì, dove venivano invitati personaggi illustri e dove Don Milani metteva questi giovani operai nella condizione di essere degli interlocutori attendibili, e quindi preparava con attenzione questi incontri. Il povero relatore malcapitato si trovava presto sotto processo e doveva rispondere alle domande incalzanti di questi giovani. Don Lorenzo Milani era attento affinché nessuno rimanesse ai margini del dibattito e soprattutto i ragazzi più timidi potessero diventare protagonisti. Qual è l'idea di questa scuola? è una scuola che vuole dare la parola ai poveri, la parola alle persone senza parola, perché possano diventare protagonisti, possano diventare cittadini sovrani, come si dirà poi in lettera a una professoressa. E dare la parola ai poveri era uno degli obiettivi principali di questa scuola, che richiamava anche una rubrica della rivista Adesso, diretta da Don Primo Mazzolari, che così scriveva il 15 gennaio del 1949, presentando questa rubrica, e secondo me molto in sintonia anche col lavoro di Don Milani. Parlare dei poveri, parlare ai poveri, parlare in nome dei poveri, dare la parola ai poveri è un'altra cosa. Più facile dare loro una bandiera, una tessera, un canto, un passo, una bomba a mano, un mitra, più facile dare loro ragione. Perché cito queste parole? Perché mi sembra che qui ci sia un aspetto centrale della scuola di Don Milani. L'obiettivo non è quello di parlare dei poveri, ma dare la parola ai poveri, perché soltanto i poveri potranno realizzare una società più giusta, più equa, più inclusiva. È partendo da un punto di vista diverso che potremo dare vita a una realtà nuova. E in una lettera all'amico Giampaolo Meucci del marzo del 1955, Don Milani propone anche a lui di istituire una scuola popolare a Firenze. È interessante la motivazione. Scrive Don Milani: non come dono da fare ai poveri, ma come debito da pagare e dono da ricevere. Non per insegnare, ma solo per dare i mezzi tecnici necessari, cioè la lingua, ai poveri, per poter insegnare essi a voi le inesauribili ricchezze di equilibrio, di saggezza, di concretezza, di religiosità potenziale che Dio ha nascosto nel loro cuore, quasi per compensarli della sperequazione culturale di cui sono vittime. È quindi dalla cattedra della povertà che Don Lorenzo Milani pensa alla scuola. Una scuola che dovrà dare una svolta alla nostra società, e sono soltanto i poveri che potranno essere protagonisti di questo cambiamento. A Barbiana, e vado verso la conclusione, la scuola avrà delle caratteristiche molto diverse rispetto alla scuola popolare di San Donato. Sarà una sorta di pluriclasse in cui saranno presenti contemporaneamente ragazzi e ragazze di età diverse, dove è prevista la mutua educazione, dove ci saranno i ragazzi più grandi che insegneranno ai ragazzi più piccoli. Don Milani organizzerà delle visite all'estero e insegnerà le lingue ai suoi ragazzi usando un giradischi alimentato da una batteria di un'automobile, perché a Barbiana non ci sarà l'energia elettrica, ma si inventerà una sorta di Erasmus ante litteram, quindi con l'aiuto di amici permetterà a questi giovani montanari, che molto spesso non erano stati nemmeno in città a Firenze, di viaggiare, di andare in Germania, di andare in Inghilterra, di andare in altri luoghi. L'obiettivo è sempre imparare la lingua per poter dialogare anche con altri operai, con altri contadini di altre zone del mondo. E l'idea di fondo qual è? L'idea è quella raccontata a Barbiana. In uno dei racconti di questi ragazzi in esperienze pastorali si dice: l'anno dopo ero maestro, cioè lo ero 3 mezze giornate la settimana. Insegnavo geografia, matematica e francese a prima media. Per scorrere un Atlante o spiegare le frazioni non occorre la laurea. Se sbagliavo qualcosa, poco male. Era un sollievo per i ragazzi. Si cercava insieme. Le ore passavano serene, senza paura e senza soggezione. Lei, riferito alla professoressa, non sa fare scuola come me. Poi insegnando imparavo tante cose. Per esempio, ho imparato che il problema degli altri è uguale al mio. Sortirne tutti insieme è la politica, sortirne da soli è l'avarizia. Ecco, la scuola allora diventa una sorta di comunità di apprendimento, diventa il luogo in cui chi ha di più, chi sa di più, lo mette a disposizione degli altri. Scriveva Don Lorenzo che il sapere serve solo per darlo, non è qualcosa che serve per alimentare il narcisismo di chi ce l'ha. Noi oggi quando parliamo del merito immaginiamo qualcosa che deve dare lustro a chi ha avuto più risorse. Per Don Milani il merito era responsabilità, era la responsabilità di restituire agli altri quello che abbiamo ricevuto. E allora la scuola non doveva servire per alimentare, diciamo così, l'ambizione delle persone che avevano avuto un'istruzione, ma doveva essere uno strumento per dare a tutti la possibilità di essere cittadini, protagonisti della società di domani. Ecco, io credo che una scuola così è una scuola di cui abbiamo bisogno anche oggi, di una scuola che mette al centro il motto IKEA, mi interessa, mi sta a cuore, sono partecipe della tua situazione, una scuola che non ha i voti, ma non perché è una scuola disimpegnata, ma perché è una scuola così impegnata e impegnativa che non ha bisogno del voto per motivare lo studio dei ragazzi, perché parla il linguaggio della vita, perché offre delle opportunità concrete di riscatto a ciascuno. E voglio concludere allora con una frase presa da una lettera intima scritta da Don Milani a Michele Gesualdi, uno dei ragazzi che vivevano in casa con lui, in quel momento all'estero, e Don Lorenzo scrivendo a lui fa un po' anche un bilancio di quello che è il significato ultimo dell'esperienza della scuola, e con questo chiudo il mio breve intervento. Scrive Don Lorenzo Milani a questo suo figlio: la scuola deve tendere tutta nell'attesa di quel giorno glorioso in cui lo scolaro migliore le dice: povera vecchia, non ti intendi più di nulla. E la scuola risponde con la rinuncia a conoscere i segreti del suo figliolo, felice soltanto che il suo figliolo sia vivo e ribelle. Abbiamo anche oggi bisogno di una scuola che crei degli alunni, dei figlioli che siano vivi e ribelli per cambiare il mondo in cui viviamo, per renderlo più equo, più giusto, più inclusivo.
Quindi abbiamo una scuola con la musica ribelle, come cantava
Esatto.
qualcuno, Eugenio Finardi, che era molto politico. I want to say this in English. I hope you can follow. For those of you who are not familiar with Italian, I can assure you, si può dirlo, no, Domenico, that the gist of Domenico's talk will appear open access online in the following, within a few weeks in the latest issue of Convergence. Don Milani, the article, most of the quotes that Domenico gave us are there in that piece. So the gist of the whole discussion will be available in English, written, of course, as an article in Convergence, the last issue for 2023, which is about to go into production because it's inserted in a special issue of which I'm dependent on the guest editors for that. So, grazie molto Domenico. Adesso passo la parola a mia altra amica Emiliana Mangone, che conosce l'inglese, però io penso che preferisce parlare la sua lingua materna, che è l'italiano. È una sociologa dall'Università di Salerno. Poche settimane fa ha organizzato un convegno su Don Milani, come quello di Bergamo, dove Domenico e io ci siamo incontrati ultimamente. Allora lui era all'Università di Salerno, a Fisciano, Emiliana came to Malta and was a guest of our faculty. She addressed our students in our international social adult education for social change. Emiliana, the screen and the space is yours.
Thank you very much. My English is terrible, and then I prefer to speak in Italian.
It is an official language of this
Okay.
webfest.
Il mio intervento sarà, come dire, da sociologo e non da pedagogista, quindi, come dire, con una prospettiva un po' diversa, pur focalizzando su, come dire, la disciplina cardine, cioè l'educazione, perché cercherò di portare avanti una sorta di parallelo tra Don Milani e Freire rispetto appunto al loro modello educativo che in realtà aveva l'obiettivo comune, cioè quello di poter raggiungere, forse in maniera utopistica, ma che, come diceva già Domenico, se mi posso permettere di darti del tu,
Certo.
bisogna, come dire, rinnovare e promuovere di nuovo in una società che subisce forti cambiamenti in maniera anche a volte radicali, senza riuscire ad adattarci a questi cambiamenti. E l'obiettivo qual era? Quello di giustizia sociale, che si traduceva in quegli anni, tenendo conto, io oggi non mi ricordavo le date di nascita, sono andata a vedere quella di Don Milani, me la ricordavo molto bene, non mi ricordavo quella di Paolo Freire, ma con mio grande, come dire, non stupore, ma lo immaginavo, sono nati a 2 anni di distanza, nel senso che
1921.
23 Don Milani e 21 Freire. Purtroppo Don Milani ci ha lasciato troppo presto, altrimenti immagino un dialogo tra di loro abbastanza fitto. In realtà si trovano a lavorare in 2 contesti totalmente differenti. Noi uscivamo, come dire, dalla seconda conflitto mondiale e in America Latina, voglio dire, c'erano tutte le problematiche che c'erano. L'obiettivo era comune: ridurre le diseguaglianze. E qual era l'unico mezzo per poter ridurre le diseguaglianze? Era quello di educare i soggetti, perché un soggetto educato, questo lo dicevano loro, ma lo dovremmo ribadire oggi, un soggetto educato è anche un cittadino che partecipa e partecipativo nei processi anche decisionali. Voglio utilizzare alcune parole chiavi, definendo in un unico modello sia il modello educativo di Don Milani sia quello di Paolo Freire, e cioè come un modello tendente alla coscientizzazione, qui prendo, come dire, un termine strettamente di Paolo Freire, e liberazione, che è incluso invece in tutto il modello educativo di Don Milani, ed entrambi i termini sono inclusi in quel I care che Don Milani aveva fisso sulla porta dell'aula dove come dire, lui faceva lezione. Perché ho messo insieme questi 2 termini? Perché sostanzialmente sia Don Milani, con le sue pratiche educative che erano sostanzialmente collettive, quello che oggi si fa, ma si fa in maniera distorta, nel senso che noi abbiamo delle aule, le classi attuali, in cui si attribuisce, cioè si cerca di fornire la stessa nozione a tutti. In realtà Don Milani faceva lo stesso, ma qual era la differenza sostanziale? È lo stesso per Paolo Freire con quello che lui chiamava il dialogo aperto. C'erano le domande. Quando Domenico ha detto le conferenze del venerdì mettevano sotto esame chi andava a tenere, come dire, la relazione alla conferenza, è giusto perché gli allievi di Don Milani facevano le domande e il domandare è l'elemento che, per esempio, Paulo Freire attribuisce a domandare che cosa dobbiamo fare. Il processo di coscientizzazione si realizza nel momento in cui non solo si fa, ma sostanzialmente ci si chiede che cosa fare per poter cambiare. E l'idea che sottendeva alla pedagogia della speranza di Paulo Freire, cioè di un mondo possibile, dell'educare al possibile, era lo stesso che era di base alla scuola di Bappiana, fondamentalmente. Il educare alla critica della società e dei mutamenti. La famosa lettera ai cappellani militari, in cui appunto si poneva l'attenzione sulla necessità di cominciare a dire no su alcune cose, diventa dirimente anche oggi. Oggi il no è un termine, sono due letterine messe a fianco che spessissimo dovrebbero essere utilizzate e che non vengono utilizzate. E quell'obbedienza non è più una virtù, dovrebbe tornare di nuovo ad essere, come dire, un baluardo delle trasformazioni della società. La parola, il dialogo e la critica. Questi sono tre elementi che vengono fortemente, potremmo dire enfatizzati, ma in realtà applicati è il termine giusto, sia da entrambi questi educatori, potremmo definirli pedagogisti, non lo so qual è il termine più opportuno. Io utilizzerei forse un altro termine, che può essere quello di accompagnatore di un processo. E qual era in realtà il processo che sia Don Milani che Freire volevano, come dire, accompagnare? Era quello dell'emancipazione dei soggetti all'interno delle realtà che vivevano, e quindi la prima cosa che loro tendevano a fare era quella di educare, istruire i soggetti a leggere la società. Quell'aspetto che spessissimo è banalizzato di Don Milani, il saper leggere, far di conto e scrivere, in realtà era fondamentale, perché quelli per i contadini era l'unico strumento per la loro emancipazione in una società italiana in cui era ancora possibile quella che noi sociologi chiamiamo mobilità verticale, quindi, come dire, un cambio all'interno delle classi sociali. L'altro aspetto che accomuna Lorenzo Milani e Paolo Freire è l'idea di un'educazione che non è neutra. Non è neutra, e non è neutra lo ha dimostrato non solo con la lettera ai cappellani, ma l'ho dimostrato in tante altre lettere private, negli epistolari, lo ha chiarito molto bene. Non è neutra perché in realtà l'educazione per entrambi si trasforma in azione politica, dove l'azione politica è quell'azione che il collettivo e gli individui attuano, realizzano per poter cambiare. E il tutto però parte dal processo di coscientizzazione. Se i soggetti non prendono coscienza di una condizione di oppressione, difficilmente riescono poi anche ad agire. Si diceva, prima Domenico faceva cenno al fatto che con le piccole risorse che aveva Don Milani ha cercato di realizzare quello che oggi anche i nostri studenti universitari fanno, cioè l'Erasmus, andare all'estero, fare tante esperienze, ma non solo fare tante esperienze, fare esperienza per conoscere altre società e altre forme di cultura. Ma io credo che Don Lorenzo aveva anche un'altra caratteristica. Avendo studiato all'Accademia di Belle Arti, aveva quell'aspetto creativo che forse mancava a tutti gli educatori. Troppo irrigimentati, se vogliamo utilizzare un termine militaresco, entro certi come dire, binari, entro certi canali da cui non si può, come dire, non si poteva fuoriuscire in quel periodo. Non è un caso che esperienze pastorali viene fortemente criticato, anzi ritirato, pur avendo avuto un'iniziale autorizzazione, viene poi, come dire, ritirato. Giustizia sociale ed educazione vanno di pari passo, non può essere diversamente. Non può essere diversamente, questo lo pensava anche un altro studioso cattolico, Maritain nei suoi scritti e nei suoi studi in realtà sosteneva che il riconoscimento dei diritti fondamentali è una delle necessità affinché gli uomini possano essere liberi e l'altra era quella di creare una comunità che abbandonasse in parte le sovranità nazionali per poter, come dire, garantire i diritti umani. Don Milani forse non parlava di diritti umani, parlava di diritti umani concretizzati all'interno di una società che stava mutando. Da lì a poco abbiamo avuto quello che è stato il boom economico degli anni, a partire dagli anni 50, con grosse trasformazioni all'interno della nostra società, sia da un punto di vista sociale, da un punto di vista politico, e quindi necessariamente il tutto si doveva tradurre nella prassi e andava tutto orientato a quell'idea di eliminare quel homo homini lupus di Hobbesiana memoria. In lettera ad una professoressa lui chiarisce qual è il fine dell'educazione. Quel merito che allora veniva sbandierato con la promozione, oggi è diventato quasi un'ideologia da voler necessariamente attuare, dimenticandosi però l'aspetto centrale sia di Don Milani che di Freire, e cioè che nel rapporto educatore-educando bisogna riconoscere nell'altro, e cioè nell'educando, una persona che ha una propria identità e personalità. L'idea di un'educazione critica oggi mi sembra alquanto utopistica, ma se discutere di Don Milani in occasione del centenario della sua nascita, possa essere un'occasione per affrontare nuovamente in maniera aperta tutte le questioni che riguardano i processi educativi oggi, ben venga, come dire, un centenario ogni anno, perché con l'avvento della società neoliberista, di cui in questo momento non sappiamo se siamo ancora in una parabola ascendente o in una parabola discendente, vi è sempre più la necessità che ci sia una educazione critica che faccia riflettere non solo chi è nella posizione dell'educando, ma anche chi è nella posizione di educatore. Quello che sia Don Milani che Freire probabilmente è un modello educativo riflessivo ed autoriflessivo, ed è, credo, la riflessività che debba tornare all'interno dei modelli educativi. Penso all'Italia e ai modi in cui il tutto oramai viene tradotto in una sequenza di azioni burocratiche dove la persona ha perso la sua centralità. E ben vengano tutte le azioni, come dire, di creative che possano essere utili allo sviluppo di questi nuovi modelli che si rifacciano o a quello collettivo di Don Milani o a quello dell'azione dialogica culturale di Paolo Freire. Io vi ringrazio e chiudo qui il mio breve intervento.
Grazie mille Emiliana. Thank you very much, Emiliana. I hope you can follow when I speak in English for a larger audience. Now we are open to questions. It's interesting the bringing together of Paulo Freire and Don Milani. There are other people we must bring in. These people have to be seen against the spirit of the age in which they operated. Now, I'm not saying that what was important during the 60s, late 60s, late 67, when Don Milani died, and when he was still guiding before that, directing Lettera a una Professoressa. But I'm not saying the issues of the time are not important today. They are. They still are. Unfortunately, we don't have that spirit, I find, of the 60s. But those issues are still there. We have to see this against the background of, first of all, Lettera a una Professoressa was not just an educational text. It was not just a critique of schooling. It was a critique, as Pier Paolo Pasolini, a very important figure intellectually at the time, and still today, I think most of what he said is still relevant, especially today when we talk about the survival, recurrence of fascism in its various forms within a so-called representative democracy. So it brings to mind consumism, the criticism of Don Milani of the consumerist society, still relevant today, and which Pasolini criticized openly, even at the time. Let's not forget that how Pasolini defined Lettera a una Professoressa, un vento di vitalità, a wind of vitality. It is a critique of the Italian schooling system, but it is more than that, he says. It is a critique of Italian society in general. Non per caso, I'm no wonder that that book is considered, as you, my Italian colleagues now, like Emiliana and Domenico, will tell me, despite any kind of religious motivation behind it, that book was considered to be a manifesto of the 68 movement, which included people who were the Perinis, the people who went to university and became part of the different movements within the 68 movement, who celebrated a text by those very same people, those very same boys who were the Gianni Bocciati. So the Pierini in the movements celebrated the Gianni Bocciati. It's quite ironic, that situation. So it was more than just a text about education. It was more a text about, Italian society in general, so much so that it became almost like a manifesto of the 68 movement. It was also, the same could be said about Esperienze Pastorali, still to be translated into English, not that it's for greater effect and resonance, which is also not just a religious book. It is not just it is a sociological book, period. Not sociology of education, but sociology in general. And I think it's a classic of Italian sociology. Should be treated as such. Maybe Emiliano, you don't agree with me with this, but I think that's how I personally see it as such. So this is for me the importance of somebody whose motivation, it can also be religious, but who looked at religion differently, with the fresh eyes of somebody who came into Catholicism from outside, from an agnostic or atheist family, not like us, many of us, who were brainwashed into a particular religion, which we used to take for granted, and then all of a sudden, some of us have this transformation. He had a transformation in a different direction, so he comes in with fresh eyes, but he's at the basis of it was not teaching religion, but broadening one's education, educating people in their whole holistic way, in multiple subjectivities. Only then are you prepared, therefore, to respond to any call from a higher being as a grace of God. So you have to have a basic education. And I think that is what makes him very interesting for people who have nothing to do with religion. It will be unfair to play down the religious element, because that's dishonest. Like that, the same applies to Paulo Freire. Many people try to secularize Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire was not secular at all. I mean, he had made no bones about his religious beliefs. I heard him say this publicly, I'm a man of faith. And by man of faith, he was not being general. He was referring about the Christian faith, confirmed to me by members of his family. Okay? But of course, in places like North America, they try to over-secularize somebody by playing down that dimension. That is very dishonest as far as I'm concerned. But he speaks to wider issues than religion. I mean, the way he approached religion is also involved a humanistic approach to education in its broader dimensions. The same could apply to a person from a different religion like Ibn Khaldun, who was a Muslim. But what Ibn Khaldun wrote in the 14th century went beyond Islam. You cannot deny the Islamic element there, but went beyond. It was one of the first, probably one of the oldest forms of sociology that we came across in his work. So any questions to the two speakers or to all speakers in general? And then we'll conclude today's session. Michael? Of course, people have the right to remain silent. Do we have any questions? To Domenico and to Emiliano.
Yeah, basically, one thing, even, I mean, continuing with what Peter was saying. Basically, I mean, especially to both of you, since you come from an Italian context, do you think that that Milani has been, I mean, even in Italy, I mean, each side seems to take a part of him and leave another, has not been appreciated holistically in his different facets. Keep in mind, there was a book recently, I cannot remember the name, it's the one which I mentioned, Pete. For instance, some certain aspects which were very interesting It was written by one of his students, but it wasn't xismu dal-li ħajtkellem għada, Pita, Pitada.
One of the students, Eduardo Martinelli.
But not but Martinelli, but someone else was normally in the alignment. For instance, I don't know, mentions that when they went to England, he was very...
Eduardo Martinelli went to England.
But this guy is not Martinelli. He was very adamant, for instance, that they shouldn't attend Anglican services. So in a certain way, I mean, my whole point is, latching up to what Peter is saying, do you think that he has been, I mean, in a way remolded by whoever kind of was trying to relieve him in his or her own image? And not appreciate his holistic...
Viene interpretato
Scusa. No, ognuno fa la propria...
L'appropriazione
di Milani, sia che questo sia un santino.
Se io sono marxista, allora è un prete rosso. È così. Sì.
Non so, Emiliano Simeone.
Domenico è
Domenico.
Emiliano. Forse no.
Visto che sapete più di noi, nel senso che siete in un contesto italiano, no?
Ci sono, scusate, ma... non so, Emiliana, vuoi dire tu qualcosa? Vuoi che...
No, io mentre, come dire, quando ho chiuso mi è venuta in mente una cosa che è una provocazione per noi sociologi, cioè quando Peter diceva non è solo una critica al modello di scuola italiano, ma è una critica alla società italiana. Aveva perfettamente ragione, nel senso che potremmo dire che Don Milani è stato un bravo sociologo, peccato che i sociologi, soprattutto quelli dell'educazione, non lo studiano, tra l'altro, perché
anche in Italia
ha capito, come dire, in una sorta di previsione, probabilmente anche dai suoi studi o dal suo modo di approcciare alla vita lui stesso, dove probabilmente sarebbe andata la società italiana, e quindi aveva capito che l'unico mezzo per poter aiutare una parte di popolazione italiana, cioè la fascia più povera, era quella di educarli. Sostanzialmente, siccome nell'arco della giornata questi non andavano a scuola perché dovevano lavorare nei campi o nelle stalle, l'unico mezzo era quello di aprire casa sua e fare lezione lì. Quindi, come dire, che sia stato considerato un prete rosso comunista, come vogliamo dire, non lo so, in tutta onestà. Aveva però questa capacità di lettura progressista, sicuramente.
Era aperto, per esempio, per fare gli studenti leggere Gramsci. Adesso, quando qualcuno, Luigi Berlinguer, fu ministro della pubblica istruzione, mi pare, no? Cugino del famoso cugino,
sì,
no?
Cugino di Enrico. È scomparso poco tempo fa.
Chi? Luigi è
Guerra.
scomparso, non lo sapevo questo. Allora, quando lui ha detto, non so, una intervista, che si dovrebbe fare leggere i quaderni del carcere al liceo classico, o non so se, io penso che al liceo classico è scoppiato la fine del mondo. C'è una critica, la critica che questa è indottrinazione, eccetera. Don Milani, pur non essendo marxista, vedi la lettera a Pipetta, per esempio, e altre cose, che lui non era, però li faceva leggere, ce lo dirà adesso Edoardo Martinelli dopodomani, ci faceva le lettere dal carcere e anche i quaderni dal carcere. Infatti Edoardo mi ha detto questo in un'intervista. Una volta nella nostra università ha detto le lettere dal carcere. Nel suo libro, che è stato ispirato da quella intervista, lo mette Edoardo Martinelli stesso, lo scrive, dal motivo occasionale al motivo profondo, e dice ai quaderni. Poi l'ho chiesto per chiarificare e ha detto no, entrambi. Faceva leggere queste cose perché queste hanno un valore, un tasso intellettuale molto importante che va al di là di qualunque sia il partigianismo. Non è la questione politica, ma la questione politica ridotto a livello partigiano. C'è un
Partitico.
lavoro che è propaganda, ma c'è un lavoro che è più fino. Anche Shakespeare è stato propaganda per i Tudor. Per questo ha demonizzato Riccardo III, perché Riccardo III storicamente si dice era molto differente da quando viene. Però Shakespeare è un lavoro che trascende proprio qualunque posizione propagandistica da parte. Insomma,
Posso-
oggi fra la sinistra questa cosa si dice questa è propaganda politica, come poteva succedere in Brasile sotto Bolsonaro, è scuola senza partito. Domenico.
No, mi viene da fare una battuta, soprattutto per chi è italiano e conosce la cronaca di questi giorni. Sembra che tutti siano parenti di Gramsci, compresa Giorgia Meloni, ma insomma questa è solo è una battutaccia. No, invece per tornare a Don Milani e a questioni più serie, devo dire che ogni tentativo di incasellare Don Milani in una categoria è destinato, secondo me, a fallire, perché Don Milani è un personaggio complesso. Per certi aspetti è un sacerdote tradizionale che segue il modello tridentino, perché all'interno di quel contesto che è stato formato è obbediente alla Chiesa, tanto da essere quasi ossessivamente attento a non essere fuori dagli insegnamenti del Magistero della Chiesa, ma è invece per molti aspetti rivoluzionario. Esperienze pastorali è un libro che anticipa di 50 anni la riflessione pastorale della Chiesa. È vero che non è molto attento a quello che accade in quegli anni nell'ambito del Concilio Vaticano II, ma alcuni temi presenti in esperienze pastorali anticipano il dibattito del Concilio Vaticano II. Ho detto che il modello che segue di sacerdozio è fondamentalmente tridentino, ma durante gli anni del seminario studia i testi francesi e studia Francia, paese di missione, e in qualche modo esperienze pastorali per certi aspetti si rifà a quello studio e ha ragione Emiliana quando dice che quello è un testo di sociologia, secondo me, molto raffinato, dove tra l'altro la statistica anticipa quella che oggi invece noi chiamiamo infografica, cioè dove c'è un modo di rappresentare la statistica che già di per sé è espressivo del contenuto. Non solo i sociologi non studiano quel testo di Don Milani, ma nemmeno i pedagogisti studiano esperienze pastorali e si fermano a lettera a una professoressa, ma esperienze pastorali è molto più profondo di lettera a una professoressa, perché va alle radici. Allora, quello che voglio dire è questo, che secondo me il tentativo di annettere Don Lorenzo a una parte politica non funziona, perché il suo linguaggio è molto provocatorio, lo è per i cattolici, lo è per i comunisti, e quindi non c'è modo di uscire da questa provocazione. La vera questione è come rispondiamo a questa provocazione, perché queste provocazioni ci spingono ad andare alla radice delle questioni, no? Questo mi sembra un po' il tema. Non so se ho risposto alla domanda, ma insomma.